Before I begin, I just want to explain that one of the main reasons why I rarely make videos anymore is that YouTube's algorithm and general failure to notify people who are subscribed to a channel has reduced my view count to even more of a joke than it already was to begin with, meaning that it's simply no longer worth my time and effort to go to all of the trouble of making longer videos such as this. So if you would actually like to hear more from me, then clicking the notification bell to at least increase the chances that you're notified when I upload a video would be a decent start. And also, if you'd like to make a donation through my tip jar, aka my paypal.me button, links down as your underbar, then that certainly wouldn't hurt either. And now for our feature presentation. Hello there, this is James S. Crofty, 1978, and from incels and the alt-right, from race realists, anti-feminists and anti-SJWs to fanatical Trump worshippers and Gamergate, from self-proclaimed rationalists and skeptics here on YouTube to evangelical fundamentalist creationist Christians, and from the likes of Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson and Sargon of Akkad all the way down to the 13-year-old boys who worship them, what does every so-called movement composed almost entirely of resentful and grossly insecure self-righteous white boys concocting vast global conspiracy theories to explain why everyone else is obviously so jealous of and working to undermine their innate superiority, because why else would the world no longer revolve around them have in common? Come on, the answer's in the question! Because seriously, when you look at the massive overlap between these groups and individuals, both demographically and ideologically, no matter how many token supporters they parade around to create the illusion of diversity and convince both the rest of us and themselves that they're not bigots honest, when you understand that whether they appeal to God or pseudoscience, their non-arguments and logical fallacies are always exactly the same, and most of all, when you dig deep enough to understand the emotional drive behind their outrage and their campaigns, you understand that everything they say, and at the very least claim to believe, always boils down to why doesn't the world revolve around me anymore? Because other people are quote-unquote taking over. In other words, existing independently of our petty whims and insecurities, no longer apologising for doing so and demanding equality and respect, and that makes us feel uncomfortable. When all is said and done, in fact, the far right, in inverted commas, has always been less of an ideology or a political position than it is a collective persecution complex. To quote the article links down as your underbar discussing Trump's strategy of self-victimization and why it's playing so well with his base, when he, Trump, says that he's a victim, all of his billions of dollars melt away and the power of the presidency becomes irrelevant. What people see and hear is a white man who might have been sitting on his porch complaining about how he was cheated on something. There's an emotional logic to it that is much more powerful than any exploration of reality could produce, because, quote, if there are white people who imagine that they have no privilege in this world and struggle to achieve and maintain middle-class status, and he says, reverse discrimination, ooh, it goes right to their amygdala, what is commonly known as the reptilian part of the brain. Indeed, as Lindsay Ellis points out in her recent video, also links down as your underbar, discussing the quote-unquote ideology of the First Order in the new Star Wars trilogy, the ideology of fascism, in inverted commas, is essentially nothing but any threat or enemy, real or imagined, onto which angry and insecure white boys project their amorphous rage, with the key difference between the Nazis and the Italian fascists being that while the former were largely united in their fear, hatred, blame of, and thus desire to eliminate Jews, communists, and socialists from society, with the only bone of contention being how far they should go to achieve that honourable goal, Italian fascism was always eclectic, opportunistic, and ultimately divided, with some fascists wanting to destroy the elite, while others wanted to re-establish absolute monarchy. In other words, in my humble opinion, the key reason why, in spite of always being brutal, militaristic and oppressive, Italian fascism never went to the extremes of creating concentration camps, committing a Holocaust, or otherwise mimicking the most outrageous horrors of the Nazi regime, is that Italians as a whole could never settle or agree upon a single common foe. And this being the case, the more that I read about the rise of fascism almost 100 years ago now, the more I become convinced that the reason why no one can agree on what fascism actually was, let alone agree upon what it is at the moment in the 21st century, is that when you strip away all of the insecurity, resentment and hypocrisy to reveal the ideological core of fascism, you immediately discover that there isn't one beyond each individual's desire to destroy everything which they personally blame for making them feel resentful and insecure. On top of which, I'm equally struck by the fact that no different from the not-fascists honest of today, in spite of any token gestures which existed largely, if not solely, to dupe women into supporting them, just as the Nazis described themselves as socialists, the creators and followers of that self-contradictory not an ideology that literally made itself up as it went along, hated feminism just as much as they hated socialism and communism, believing that a crisis in gender relations, i.e. women having jobs and wearing trousers, largely as a result of the First World War, was a sign of general societal decay, that communism and socialism were, quote, feminine ideologies, and therefore demanded that the nation as they idealised it be masculine again, once again as they idealised it, not having the faintest clue what they actually meant by that in practice, of course, only that women not behaving quite as much like sex dolls and doormats as they had before the war made them feel confused, angry and scared, and so they demanded the imposition of strict gender roles, with fascist art and propaganda fetishising the heroic soldier and strong male worker to an extent that almost qualified as gay porn, obsessing over their ideal of masculinity in a way that only men who are poisoned by toxic masculinity, convinced that the slightest sign of femininity, i.e. weakness, condemns them to emasculation and therefore defeat, can ever possibly be. As a matter of fact, although Seth MacFarlane obviously conceived it as a joke, and it's absolutely ludicrous to ever consider that the Holocaust was motivated by toxic masculinity, the more that I read about fascism and the more that I learn about contemporary not fascism honest, the more that this joke from Family Guy seems terrifyingly accurate. Far beyond the most obviously insecure white boys, both of the past and of today though, leaving aside the intellectually and emotionally stunted man-children who, in the past, joined movements such as Gamergate, more recently have become obsessed with testosterone levels, calling male feminists and leftists cucks and soy boys, and who in the very worst cases, indoctrinated with anti-feminist and white supremacist propaganda and conspiracy theories, become mass-murdering terrorists such as Anders Breivik, Dylan Roof, Elliot Rodger, Nicholas Cruz, and most recently the Santa Fe high school tutor, whose name I won't even dare to try and pronounce here. The only difference between demagogues as relatively accomplished and successful as the likes of Sam Harris or Jordan Peterson and their worshippers is that they've used their academic stature to rationalise and legitimise their petty, bigoted insecurities in order to manipulate and profit from those of other insecure white boys. A genuine crime against everything that they at least claim to stand for when, if they're even a fraction as intelligent and superior as they at least imply that they are with every breath that they take, they could and should be doing something infinitely more productive and beneficial to humanity than giving endless lectures, making endless podcasts, and writing countless books which all essentially boil down to science rules, Christianity drools, Islam is evil, and so a lefty, commie, pinko, feminazi, Muslimic SJWs. So look at how superior I am, and thus take comfort in the fact that you are superior as well, simply because you agree with me, as well as being a spectacular irony given the fact that, as I indicated earlier, their fundamentalist creationist Christian enemies, in inverted commas, are saying exactly the same thing, only insisting that what they twist to support their beliefs is real science, while it's anything that debunks creationism or Christianity as a whole that is bogus pseudoscience with which evil lefty pinko Muslimic Jewish feminazi communists indoctrinate their innocent children. And then even more ironically, as I stated earlier, as fellow white boys believing that they are under siege from a common threat, fighting side by side with their supposed enemies and using exactly the same non-arguments and logical fallacies, only based on pseudoscience instead of God, to attack feminists, leftists, SJWs, Muslims, the gay agenda, the trans agenda, Hollywood, Jews, the mainstream media, and everyone else who they fear is working to strip them of their privilege, entitlement, and power, which, by the way, in case I haven't made this clear enough yet, is literally everyone and everything that doesn't exist at or bend to service their petty and arbitrary whims. And speaking of Muslims, as well as Jews for that matter, considering the fact that apparently a great many on the far right didn't receive the memo that they're not supposed to hate, fear, or blame Jews anymore, even the Great Replacement, white genocide, the Islamification of Europe, or whatever other buzzword is used to describe that paranoid and bigoted conspiracy theory this week, is merely a rationalization for the paranoid and bigoted conceit that if we continue to allow brown people into our countries, then we won't be in charge anymore, extrapolating the irrational discomfort that these white boys and their token supporters feel at the sight of brown people, hijabs and burqas, into a vast conspiracy, a culture war, and even a literal war for the survival of the so-called white race, simply to make themselves feel better. Because remember, my friends, in the end, feeling better is their sole aim, goal, and purpose, no matter how many millions of people they have to kill in order to achieve it. After all, it is all entirely about their ego and their infantile fear of change, literally convincing themselves and struggling to convince everyone else that the world is literally coming to an end simply because we now control slightly less of it. And this being the case, I would laugh at these pathetic and impotent little white boys, if there weren't so goddamn many of them, elevating equally pathetic and impotent little white boys into positions of global dominance and power.